Some men carry their mistakes like scars, and Levi Gable had more than his share. After 40 years of running from the ghosts of his past, all he wanted was to die alone in the silence of Marrow Creek. Then a strange boy appeared with 2 German shepherds, their heads covered in burlap sacks. The child didn't say a word, just reached out and touched Levi's weathered hand with fingers as soft as a prayer. Then he was gone. For $10, Levi became the owner of 2 silent dogs that seemed to guard secrets he couldn't understand. The townspeople started whispering about spirits gathering near his cabin, about shadows that moved when they shouldn't. As the days passed, buried memories began surfacing. His brother left to die in Abilene, a child he never knew, and the woman whose heart he broke when he chose violence over love. But what did that mysterious boy really want from him that day? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Levi Gable's weathered face as he sat on the porch of his modest cabin, watching the 2 German shepherds that had changed everything. 3 days had passed since the boy's visit, and the dogs hadn't moved from their post by the old oak tree. They didn't eat the scraps he offered, didn't drink from the water bowl he'd set out, didn't even acknowledge his presence. They just sat there, heads tilted toward something he couldn't see, as if listening to voices carried on a wind that touched only them. Marrow Creek was the kind of place where a man could disappear if he minded his own business and kept his mouth shut. Population 47, counting the widow Henderson, who only came to town on Sundays. The main street stretched 2 blocks. Between Martha Kellaway's general store and the saloon that hadn't seen a proper crowd since the railroad passed them by in '89. Levi had chosen this place precisely because it was nowhere, a dot on no map that mattered, where the past couldn't find him and the future didn't much care to look. He'd built his cabin a mile outside town, far enough that the sound of his nightmares wouldn't wake the neighbors, close enough that he could walk to Martha's store when his supplies ran low. The structure was simple but solid: pine logs chinked with mud and grass, a stone chimney that drew clean, a roof that kept out most of the rain. It was more home than he'd known in 40 years of running, and he'd grown comfortable with its silence. Now that silence felt different, heavier, like the air before a storm that couldn't quite decide whether to break. The dogs stirred as Doc Henderson's wagon approached, their ears pricking forward but their bodies remaining still. Marcus Henderson was Marrow Creek's only physician, a man in his 50s with gentle hands and eyes that had seen too much suffering to judge anyone harshly. He'd been the one to stitch up Levi's knife wound last winter, asking no questions about how a retired drifter had come by such a precise cut between his ribs. "Morning, Levi," Doc called out, pulling his wagon to a stop. "Thought I'd check on those new additions of yours." "Martha mentioned you'd taken in a pair of strays." Levi nodded toward the oak tree. "Wouldn't exactly call them strays. Boy sold them to me fair and square, $10 and a handshake." Doc climbed down from his wagon, medical bag in hand, and approached the dogs with the careful movements of a man who'd learned to read animal behavior. The shepherds watched him, but didn't growl or retreat. If anything, they seemed to be studying him, weighing some invisible quality that Levi couldn't fathom. "They're magnificent animals," Doc said, crouching a respectful distance away. "Pure bred, I'd say. Well cared for, despite those strange head coverings when you got them. Have they been eating?" "Haven't touched a bite in 3 days. Won't drink either. Just sit there like they're waiting for something." Doc frowned, pulling out his stethoscope. "May I?" The larger of the 2 dogs, a male with a dark muzzle and intelligent brown eyes, actually moved closer to Doc, as if inviting the examination. Doc listened to the animal's heart and breathing, checked its gums and eyes, ran practiced hands over its coat. "Physically, he's in excellent health," Doc said, straightening, "but there's something unusual in his demeanor. It's as if he's not quite here with us, like he's focused on something beyond our perception." Levi felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. What kind of something? Before Doc could answer, Martha Kellaway's voice carried across the yard. "Marcus, there you are. I've been looking all over." She stopped short when she saw the dogs, her weathered face going pale. Sweet Mary and Joseph. Martha was 70 if she was a day, a woman who'd outlived 2 husbands and raised 6 children in this unforgiving country. Levi had never seen her rattled by anything, not even the time a cougar wandered into town and made itself at home in her store. But now she stood frozen, staring at the German shepherds with an expression of recognition and fear. "Martha?" Doc stood, concern evident in his voice. "What is it?" "Those dogs," she whispered. "I've seen them before, 20 years ago, maybe more. They belonged to that boy who died of the fever, Sarah's son." Levi's blood turned to ice water in his veins. "What boy? What are you talking about?" Martha's eyes fixed on him with uncomfortable intensity. "Sarah Gable. You telling me you don't remember Sarah Gable?" The name hit him like a physical blow. Sarah. Beautiful, patient Sarah, with her corn silk hair and eyes like summer sky. Thomas had loved her with the desperate intensity of a man who knew his time was borrowed. Levi had watched his younger brother transform in her presence, had seen the violence drain from Thomas's face whenever she smiled. "I remember Sarah," Levi said quietly. "Then you remember how she waited for Thomas to come back from that job in Abilene? Waited until her belly started showing, waited until the whole town knew she was carrying his child, waited until the day she died, bringing that baby into the world." The words struck him like stones. She died. Childbirth. Boy lived, though, grew up with her sister's family until the fever took him at 7 years old. Strangest thing, though, that child had 2 dogs, German shepherds just like these. Swore they talked to him, said they told him stories about his daddy. Doc was watching this exchange with growing unease. "Martha, that's impossible. These are different animals. It's been 20 years. Dogs don't live 20 years, Martha agreed, never taking her eyes off Levi. People neither sometimes, but some things don't stay buried just because you shovel dirt over them. That evening, alone in his cabin with the dogs maintaining their vigil outside, Levi pulled out a battered leather journal from beneath his mattress. The cover was cracked with age, the pages yellow and brittle, but every word remained legible. 40 years of guilt, written in his own hand during the long, sleepless nights when the ghosts wouldn't let him rest. He turned to a page dated 28 years ago, his finger tracing lines written in Kansas City. Thomas talks about that girl again. Sarah something. Says he's going to marry her after the Abilene job, settle down, maybe buy a little farm. I told him he's dreaming. Men like us don't get second chances. We take what we can and keep moving. That's the only way to stay alive. The next entry, dated 3 weeks later, was harder to read. Left Thomas in Abilene. Had to choose between the money and my brother. Chose the money. God help me, I chose the money. He was still breathing when I wrote out, still calling my name. Don't know if he made it to a doctor. Don't want to know. And the final entry from that terrible year, got word Thomas died. Shot in the gut, took 3 days. Sarah was pregnant. 3 days he laid there dying, and I was already in Colorado spending his blood money. What kind of man leaves his brother to die for a sack of coins? What kind of man breaks a promise like that? Levi closed the journal, his hands shaking. Through the window, he could see the dogs silhouetted against the moonlight, still as statues, still waiting. Sheriff Tom Briggs had been keeping the peace in Marrow Creek for 15 years, a steady man who understood that sometimes the best law enforcement meant knowing when to look the other way. He rode out to Levi's place the next morning, not as an officer making an investigation, but as a neighbor checking on unusual circumstances. Folks in town are talking, he said, accepting the cup of coffee Levi offered. Saying strange things have been happening since you got those dogs. Cold spots in houses, voices in empty rooms. Old Mrs. Patterson swears she saw her dead husband sitting at their kitchen table yesterday. People see what they need to see, Levi replied. Maybe so. But when half the town starts seeing the same impossible things, a sheriff starts paying attention. Tom sipped his coffee, studying Levi's face. You want to tell me who you really are, friend? For a moment, Levi considered it. The relief of confession, of finally setting down the weight he'd carried alone for so long. But the habit of secrecy ran too deep. I'm a man who came to Marrow Creek to die quiet. That's all you need to know. Tom nodded slowly.
Fair enough.
But if these strange happenings start affecting people's safety, we're going to have a different conversation. After the sheriff left, Levi found himself drawn to the oak tree where the dogs maintained their watch. Up close, he could see intelligence in their eyes that seemed almost human. The larger male looked directly at him, and for a moment, Levi could have sworn he saw recognition there, as if the animal knew exactly who he was and what he'd done. "What do you want from me?" he asked aloud, feeling foolish. The dog tilted its head, then did something that made Levi's heart stop. It walked to a patch of earth behind the cabin and began to dig, its powerful paws throwing dirt with urgent purpose. The female joined in, both animals working with focused intensity. Within minutes, they had unearthed something that made Levi's knees buckle, a small wooden cross, weathered but intact, with initials carved deep into the crossbeam, T.G. Thomas Gable. As Levi knelt and lifted the cross from the earth, memories flooded back with devastating clarity. The bank in Abilene, the shots fired, Thomas clutching his stomach as blood seeped between his fingers. The choice between helping his brother and escaping with their stolen fortune. The sound of Thomas calling his name as Levi spurred his horse toward the horizon. "Please," Thomas had whispered with his dying breath. "Tell Sarah I love her. Tell my child about me. Promises broken. Words never spoken." A brother abandoned to die alone, while Levi rode toward a future built on betrayal. The dogs sat back on their haunches, watching him with those unnaturally knowing eyes, waiting for him to understand, waiting for him to remember what he'd spent 40 years trying to forget. As darkness fell over Marrow Creek, Levi Gable sat holding his brother's cross. Surrounded by the gathering presence of spirits he could finally no longer deny. The boy's touch had opened something in him, awakened something that had been sleeping. The dogs were guardians, he realized now. Protectors sent to guide him through whatever reckoning was coming. In the distance, he could hear voices on the wind, whispers of the past, calling him home to face the truth he'd buried, along with his brother's memory. The silence of Marrow Creek was broken forever, and Levi understood that his time of running was finally at an end. Dawn broke gray and cold over Marrow Creek, the kind of morning that made even the hardiest souls consider staying in bed. But the German shepherds had been restless all night, pacing the perimeter of Levi's cabin with an urgency that spoke of invisible pressures building like steam in a kettle. At first light, they began to dig, not the casual excavation of the previous day, but frantic, desperate clawing at the earth behind his cabin. Dirt flew in all directions as both animals worked with singular focus, their breathing heavy and labored. Levi watched from his porch, coffee growing cold in his hands, as they carved deeper and deeper into ground that seemed to call to them. 20 minutes of digging revealed the wooden cross. 10 minutes more brought up fragments of cloth, a child's shirt faded blue with tiny wooden buttons still intact, and then, nested in what remained of a small wooden box, the dogs uncovered something that stopped Levi's heart completely, a tin-type photograph, protected by oiled leather, showing a woman he recognized immediately. Sarah Gable, beautiful and young, holding an infant in her arms. But this wasn't the Sarah of his memories, glowing with pregnancy and hope. This was Sarah after childbirth, exhausted and pale, cradling a baby that seemed impossibly small and fragile. On the back of the photograph, written in Sarah's careful script, Thomas Jr., age 3 months. May God forgive us all. The dogs stopped digging and sat back, their mission complete. They looked at Levi with eyes that seemed to hold decades of patience, as if they'd been waiting 40 years for this exact moment. The larger male approached slowly and laid his head against Levi's leg, the first physical contact either animal had initiated since arriving. The touch sent a shock through Levi's system, not painful but overwhelming, like being struck by lightning made of memory. Suddenly he was 28 years old again, riding hard through Texas heat with his brother at his side. Thomas was laughing about something, his face bright with the joy of a man in love, describing the house he wanted to build for Sarah, the children they'd raise, the life they'd create together, far from the violence that had defined them. "She's carrying my baby." "Levi," Thomas had said, his voice filled with wonder. "Can you believe it?" "Mia, Daddy. I'm going to do right by her, I swear it. After Abilene, I'm hanging up my guns for good." The memory shifted, became darker. The bank in Abilene, their biggest score yet. Thomas crouched behind an overturned table, blood spreading across his shirt, his face grey with pain and shock. "The baby," he'd whispered as Levi faced the terrible choice. "Promise me you'll take care of the baby." But there had been no time for promises, no time for anything except the choice between love and money, loyalty and survival. Levi had chosen survival, and it had cost him everything that mattered. Now, holding the photograph of the nephew he'd never known existed, Levi felt the weight of that choice settling on his shoulders like a shroud. Thomas Jr. had been real, had lived and breathed, and probably wondered why his father never came home, why his uncle never came to visit. The boy in the photograph couldn't have been more than 3 months old when it was taken, but even in that tiny face, Levi could see echoes of Thomas's features. The temperature around the cabin began to drop despite the morning sun. Levi's breath misted in the suddenly frigid air as frost formed on the windows of his cabin. The dogs pressed closer to him, their warm bodies a comfort against the supernatural cold that seemed to emanate from the disturbed earth. Then he heard it. A voice carried on wind that touched nothing else. Soft and familiar and impossible. Levi, Thomas's voice exactly as he remembered it. Young and hopeful, and tinged with the desperation of a dying man. Levi spun around, searching the empty yard, but saw nothing except the dogs watching him with perfect stillness. The voice came again, closer this time, as if someone were standing just behind his shoulder. "You left me, brother. You left me and you left my boy, Thomas." Levi's voice cracked like that of a much younger man. "Thomas, is that you?" The cold intensified until ice crystals began forming on the wooden cross in his hands. The photograph grew so cold it burned his fingers, but he couldn't let go. Through the supernatural chill, images flashed before his eyes with devastating clarity. Sarah, heavy with child, standing at the window of a small house, watching the road for a man who would never return. Sarah in labor, calling out Thomas's name as she brought his son into the world. Sarah dying 3 days later, her strength spent, leaving behind an infant with no father and an uncle who didn't know he existed. The baby growing up in the care of Sarah's sister, never knowing his father's name or the reason his mother died alone. A child who talked to invisible companions, who claimed 2 German shepherds visited him in dreams and told him stories about brave men and broken promises. Thomas Jr. at age 7, burning with fever, calling out for his daddy as the sickness consumed him. His final words, whispered to dogs that only he could see. "Tell Uncle Levi I forgive him." The visions ended as abruptly as they'd begun, leaving Levi gasping in air that had suddenly returned to normal temperature. The dogs were gone, simply vanished as if they'd never been there. But on the ground where they'd been sitting, 2 more objects had appeared, a child's wooden toy horse, carved with the same craftsmanship as the cross, and beneath it a folded piece of paper that looked far too old to have survived 40 years of weather. With trembling fingers, Levi unfolded the paper. It was a letter written in Sarah's hand, dated just 2 weeks before Thomas Jr.'s death. "My dearest Thomas, I write this knowing you may never read it, but hoping somehow these words will find their way to you wherever you are. Our son is dying. The fever has taken hold, and the doctor says there's nothing more to be done. He asks for you constantly, calls your name in his sleep. I've told him stories about his brave father, about the good man you were beneath all that pain and anger. He says strange things sometimes, claims he talks to guardian angels who watch over him, says they tell him about his Uncle Levi, about how sorry you both are for the choices you made. They don't understand what he means, but there's such peace in his face when he talks about forgiveness. If you're reading this, if you're still alive somewhere in this world, Please know that I never blamed you for what happened in Abilene. I know you would have come back if you could. I know you would have been a good father. And I know that wherever you are now, you're watching over our boy with all the love you carried in your heart. Tell Levi that Thomas Jr. forgives him. Tell him that some mistakes are too heavy for one man to carry alone. Your Sarah. The letter fell from Levi's nerveless fingers as the full weight of 40 years of grief crashed down on him. Thomas Jr. had known. Somehow, in whatever realm exists beyond death, the child had understood the truth about Abilene, about the choice Levi had made, about the guilt that had driven him into 40 years of exile, and he had forgiven him. The realization should have brought relief, but instead, it brought something far more devastating, the understanding that his guilt had been a luxury he could no longer afford. Thomas Jr. hadn't spent 7 years of life blaming the uncle who'd abandoned his father. He'd spent them trying to send a message of forgiveness to a man too broken to receive it. As Levi knelt in the dirt behind his cabin, surrounded by the physical evidence of lives he'd failed to save, he finally understood what the mysterious boy had been trying to tell him. The touch that had felt like forgiveness wasn't a blessing, it was a summons. A call to finally face the truth he'd been running from for 4 decades. The dogs reappeared as suddenly as they'd vanished, taking their positions beneath the oak tree. But now Levi could see them for what they truly were, not merely animals, but guardians sent by a child's love to guide a broken man toward the redemption he'd never believed possible. The wooden cross burned in his palm, warm now instead of cold, as if Thomas Jr.'s spirit had finally found the uncle it had been seeking all along. And in that warmth, Levi felt something he hadn't experienced since Abilene, the possibility that some promises, even broken ones, might still be kept. The days following the discovery of Thomas Jr.'s belongings passed in a haze of memories and mounting supernatural activity. Levi found himself drawn repeatedly to the wooden cross and the photograph, studying every detail as if they might reveal some hidden message from beyond the grave. The dogs had resumed their vigil beneath the oak tree, but their behavior had changed. They no longer seemed to be waiting. Now they appeared to be watching, alert sentries guarding against something Levi couldn't identify. It was Martha Kellaway who provided the next piece of the puzzle, arriving at his cabin 3 days later with a bundle of letters tied in faded ribbon. She climbed down from her wagon with the careful movements of a woman who'd learned not to trust her aging joints, but her eyes held the sharp intelligence that had made her Marrow Creek's unofficial keeper of secrets for 40 years. "These belong to you," she said without preamble, placing the bundle in his hands. "Sarah gave them to me before she died, made me promise to hold them until someone came looking for answers about Thomas." Levi's hands trembled as he untied the ribbon. The letters were addressed in Sarah's careful script, but not to Thomas as he'd expected. Each envelope bore his own name, Levi Gable, in care of Martha Kellaway, General Store, Marrow Creek, Texas. "She knew I was here?" he whispered. "Sarah was a smart woman. Knew that if either of you Gable boys survived Abilene, you'd eventually find your way to the kind of place where nobody asks questions. Took her 3 years of writing letters to every nowhere town in Texas before she found someone who'd heard of a man matching your description. The first letter was dated 6 months after Thomas Jr.'s birth. Dear Levi, I don't know if this letter will find you, or if you're even still alive, but I have to try. Thomas died in Abilene, but you probably already know that. What you don't know is that he left me with more than just memories. Your nephew was born 3 months ago. I named him Thomas Jr., though he has your eyes, that same gray-green color that made Thomas look so serious when he was thinking. The baby is healthy and strong, and I tell him stories about his father every night. About how Thomas used to carve little wooden animals, about how he could make anyone laugh when the mood struck him, about how much he loved us both. I'm not writing to blame you for what happened. I know you made an impossible choice, and I know it haunts you. Thomas told me once that you'd always looked out for him, that you'd taken more beatings than any brother should to keep him safe. I imagine leaving him behind was the hardest thing you've ever done, but you have a nephew now, Levi. A little boy who carries Thomas's name and your eyes. If you ever find it in your heart to come home, we'd like to know you. Your sister-in-law, Sarah. Levi's vision blurred as he read. 20 years too late, but Sarah's words hit him with the force of physical blows. She hadn't blamed him, had understood somehow that the choice in Abilene had been between survival and sacrifice, and that he'd chosen the only option that might keep at least one Gable brother alive. The second letter was harder to read. Dear Levi, Thomas Jr. is walking now, taking those unsteady steps that all babies make when they're figuring out how their legs work. He looks more like you and Thomas every day, especially when he gets that stubborn look that I remember so well from his father. I'm writing because something happened yesterday that I can't explain. The baby was playing in the yard when 2 German shepherds appeared out of nowhere. Beautiful animals, obviously well cared for, but wearing no collars or tags. They approached Thomas Jr. like they knew him, lay down beside him while he napped in the sun. When I asked the neighbors about them, old Mrs. Patterson said she'd seen the same dogs in her dreams, that they told her they were watching over Sarah Gable's boy, which is impossible, of course, but Mrs. Patterson has never been one for flights of fancy. The strangest part is that Thomas Jr. wasn't afraid of them at all. He reached out and touched their faces like he was greeting old friends, babbled at them in that baby language that makes perfect sense to him and none to the rest of us. They stayed until sunset, then disappeared as mysteriously as they'd come. But I keep thinking about something Thomas told me once, about how his grandmother used to say that love was stronger than death, that the people we lose keep watching over us in ways we can't always understand. Maybe I'm being foolish, but I think those dogs were a message, a sign that Thomas Jr. isn't as alone in this world as it sometimes seems. I hope this letter finds you well, wherever you are. Your sister-in-law, Sarah. The third and final letter was dated just 1 week before Thomas Jr.'s death. My dearest Levi, our boy is dying. The fever came on so sudden that I barely had time to send for the doctor. And now he's telling me there's nothing more he can do. Thomas Jr. is only 7 years old, and he's already seen more pain than most children see in a lifetime. But he's not afraid. He talks constantly about the dogs, says they've been visiting him in dreams for as long as he can remember. Says they tell him stories about his father and his uncle Levi, about brave men who made mistakes but never stopped loving their family. Yesterday he asked me why his uncle Levi never came to see him. I didn't know what to say. How do you explain to a dying child that sometimes people carry guilt so heavy it keeps them from doing what their hearts most want to do? So I told him the truth as I understand it, that his uncle Levi loved him very much, but that love sometimes hurts so bad that people have to stay away to keep from making the pain worse. He thought about this for a long time, then smiled and said, "The dogs will tell him it's okay. They'll tell him I forgive him." I don't know what those words mean, but they brought such peace to his face that I couldn't question them. If you're reading this, if these letters ever find their way to you, please know that Thomas Jr. died with your name on his lips and forgiveness in his heart. He wanted you to know that he understood why you couldn't come home, and that he loved you anyway. The dogs were with him at the end. I couldn't see them, but he could. He reached out and touched something just before he closed his eyes, and for a moment his face looked exactly like Thomas's when Thomas was truly happy. Take care of yourself. Levi, you're the last of the Gables, and that means something even if you don't believe it does. Your sister-in-law, Sarah Martha, had been watching him read, her weathered face soft with compassion. When he looked up, tears streaming down his cheeks, she nodded slowly. She loved that boy something fierce, Martha said, and she never stopped hoping you'd come home. Even after Thomas Jr. died, she'd ask me to keep watching for you. Made me promise that if you ever showed up, I'd make sure you knew the whole story. Why didn't she come looking for me herself? She tried. Spent every penny she had hiring men to track you down, following rumors and false leads from here to California. But you were good at disappearing, and she was just a woman alone with a sick child. Time ran out before she could find you. Levi looked toward the oak tree, where the German shepherds sat motionless, their eyes fixed on some point beyond the horizon. The dogs, he said. They were with him when he died? According to Sarah, yes. She said they appeared the moment he drew his last breath, sat vigil over his body until the burial, then vanished. Next time anyone saw them was yesterday, when that strange boy brought them to you. The implications hit Levi like a physical blow. The mysterious child hadn't been selling him dogs, he'd been returning them. The German shepherds had been Thomas Jr.'s companions in life and death, guardians tasked with watching over the Gable family line until the last member could be found and brought home. As Martha climbed back into her wagon, she turned to him one final time. Sarah left something else for you, a map she drew of where Thomas Jr. is buried. Said if you ever came looking, you'd want to pay your respects. She handed him a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. On it, Sarah had drawn careful directions to a small cemetery outside town, with the notation, Plot 17, under the cottonwood tree. I visit every Sunday after church. That evening, as shadows lengthened across his cabin, Levi sat with Sarah's letters spread before him and tried to comprehend the magnitude of what he'd lost. Not just his brother, but a nephew who'd spent 7 short years loving an uncle he'd never met. A sister-in-law who'd forgiven him before he'd even asked for forgiveness. A family that had existed and flourished and died while he'd been running from the very love that might have saved them all. The dogs rose from their post beneath the oak tree and padded over to him, no longer aloof and mysterious, but companionable in their grief. They lay down on either side of him, warm and solid and real, as if to say, "You're not alone anymore. You never were." Sheriff Tom Briggs arrived at Levi's cabin the next morning with something heavy weighing on his conscience and a wooden box tucked under his arm. The lawman looked older than his years, as if the sleepless nights that had plagued Marrow Creek's residents were taking their toll on him as well. "Morning, Levi," he said, dismounting from his horse with obvious reluctance. "We need to talk." The German shepherds raised their heads as Tom approached, but didn't move from their positions flanking Levi's chair. There was something different about their demeanor today, less watchful, more protective, as if they decided he was finally worth guarding. "What's in the box, Sheriff?" Tom set it on the porch rail between them. "Evidence from an old case. Been sitting in my office for 20 years, and after talking to Martha yesterday, I figured it was time you saw it." Inside the box, nested in faded tissue paper, was a silver pocket watch. Levi recognized it immediately, their grandfather's watch, the one Thomas had carried every day of his adult life. The case was tarnished and dented, but when Levi opened it, the hands still moved in perfect rhythm. Engraved on the inside cover were the words, "To Thomas, with love from Papa Gable, 1854. "Where did you get this?" "Off a dead child," Tom said quietly. "Boy named Thomas Jr. Gable, died of fever 20 years ago. His aunt brought him to me right before he passed, said he'd been carrying it for weeks, claimed it helped him talk to his father." Levi's hands shook as he held the watch. "That's impossible. Thomas had this with him in Abilene. According to the records I pulled, Thomas Gable died in that bank robbery. Shot in the gut, took 3 days to die. Doctor who treated him said he kept asking for someone to give his watch to his son. Made the doc promise to find a way to get it to the boy." The sheriff paused, studying Levi's reaction. "Funny thing about that doctor, though. He died in a riding accident 2 days after Thomas passed. Never had a chance to fulfill that promise. So how did a 7-year-old boy in Marrow Creek end up with a dead outlaw's watch?" Levi knew the answer, even if he couldn't bring himself to say it aloud. The same way Thomas Jr. had known about the dogs. The same way he'd carried messages of forgiveness from beyond the grave. The boundary between life and death wasn't as solid as most people believed, especially when love was strong enough to breach it. "The boy's aunt said something else," Tom continued. "Said Thomas Jr. told her the watch would help his uncle Levi find his way home when he was ready. He'd died with it clutched in his hands, and she buried it with him, except somehow it ended up in my evidence room instead." You think I'm this Uncle Levi? Tom's smile was sad and knowing. Son, I've been a lawman for 30 years. I can spot a man running from his past at 100 yards. Question is, are you ready to stop running? That afternoon, Levi made his way to the cemetery outside town, following Sarah's hand-drawn map. The German shepherds accompanied him, no longer mysterious guardians, but faithful companions, walking beside a man, finally ready to face his ghosts. The cemetery was small and well-tended, surrounded by a weathered fence that had seen better decades. Most of the graves were marked with simple wooden crosses or rough-hewn stones, the resting places of hard-working people who'd lived and died without fanfare. Plot 17 was exactly where Sarah had indicated, beneath a massive cottonwood tree that provided shade from the harsh Texas sun. The gravestone was modest. Thomas Gable, Jr., beloved son, 1873-1880. He talked to angels. Levi knelt beside the grave, his throat tight with emotion he'd spent 40 years suppressing. The earth here looked different somehow, richer, darker, as if nourished by something more than rain and time. Fresh wildflowers had been placed at the headstone, blue bonnets and Indian paintbrush, the kind that grew wild in the meadows around Marrow Creek. Someone's been taking care of you, Levi whispered to the grave. As if in answer, a voice spoke behind him. Every Sunday for 20 years. Levi turned to find Doc Henderson approaching through the cemetery gates, his medical bag replaced by a small bouquet of the same wildflowers that adorned Thomas Jr.'s grave. The physician moved with the careful reverence of a man visiting sacred ground. Doc, what are you doing here? Marcus Henderson knelt beside Levi, placing his flowers next to the existing bouquet. Same thing you are, I imagine. Paying respects to family. The word hit Levi like a thunderbolt. Family? Doc's smile was gentle but sad. You really don't remember, do you? Sarah's sister, Mary. She married a Henderson, my father. Sarah lived with us after Thomas Jr. was born, helped raise him alongside my own children. That little boy was my cousin, Levi. Your nephew was my cousin. The revelations kept coming, each one reshaping Levi's understanding of the web of connections that had been invisible to him for so long. You knew who I was, suspected from the moment you showed up in Marrow Creek. You have Thomas's eyes, the same stubborn set to your jaw. But it wasn't until Martha told me about the letters that I was certain. Doc pulled out his own letter, yellowed with age. Sarah wrote to me too before she died. Asked me to watch over Thomas Jr.'s grave, to keep bringing flowers every week until someone came looking for him. She said his Uncle Levi would come home eventually, and when he did, he'd need to know that the boy was loved and remembered. Levi stared at the fresh flowers, understanding finally dawning. You've been taking care of his grave all these years. Someone had to. The boy deserved better than to be forgotten. Doc's voice carried the weight of 2 decades of faithful service. Sarah made me promise that if you ever showed up, I'd tell you the whole truth about what happened after Abilene. The truth, it turned out, was more complex than Levi had imagined. Thomas Jr. hadn't died simply of fever. He'd been born premature, weak from the stress of Sarah's difficult pregnancy and grief. The boy had battled one illness after another throughout his short life, but had somehow managed to maintain an otherworldly optimism that baffled everyone who knew him. He used to say the strangest things, Doc recalled, would talk about conversations with his father, claimed Thomas visited him in dreams and told him stories about the old days. The other children thought he was making it up. But there were times when he knew things, details about Thomas's life that nobody had ever told him. The German shepherds had settled beside the grave as if they belonged there, their presence adding an air of completion to the scene. Doc noticed them for the first time and froze. Those dogs, he whispered. I've seen them before. Martha mentioned that. Said they belonged to Thomas Jr., not belonged to him. Protected him. Doc's voice carried the authority of someone recounting medical fact rather than speculation. I was there the night he died, Levi. Fever had taken hold something fierce, and we all knew there was nothing more I could do. Sarah was beside herself with grief, but Thomas Jr. was calm as could be. Doc paused, studying the dogs with professional interest. Just before the end, he started talking to someone we couldn't see. Said his daddy was there, said Uncle Levi was coming to visit soon. Then he reached out and touched something, thin air as far as the rest of us could tell. But those dogs, I swear they materialized out of nothing the moment his hand made contact. They were there when he died, sat vigil over his body until we buried him. Then they vanished again, just melted away like they'd never existed. I've been a doctor for 30 years, seen all kinds of things that don't fit in medical textbooks. But I've never seen anything like those two. As the sun began to set over the cemetery, casting long shadows between the graves, Levi felt the weight of Thomas Jr.'s silver watch in his pocket. The boy had carried his father's memory for 7 short years, had somehow maintained faith in an uncle who'd never come to visit, had died with forgiveness on his lips for a man who didn't deserve it. He knew I was coming, Levi said quietly. He always knew, Doc confirmed. Used to tell me that Uncle Levi was lost but not gone, that the angels would help him find his way home when it was time. I thought it was just the fever talking, the wishes of a lonely child. But now, he gestured toward the dogs, who had risen and were looking expectantly toward the cemetery gates, as if waiting for someone. In the distance, a figure was approaching through the twilight, a small boy, walking with the unhurried pace of someone who had all the time in the world. Levi's breath caught in his throat. The child was exactly as he remembered, slight build, serious expression, clothes that seemed to belong to another era. But now, in the fading light beside Thomas Jr.'s grave, Levi could see the family resemblance that had been hidden before. The boy had Thomas's gentle eyes and the stubborn Gable jawline, softened by youth but unmistakable. "Hello, Uncle Levi," the boy said, his voice carrying across the cemetery like a whisper of wind through grass. "I've been waiting for you to visit." Doc Henderson's face had gone pale, but he didn't flee or cry out in fear. Instead, he removed his hat in a gesture of respect. "Thomas Jr.?" The boy nodded solemnly. "Hello, Cousin Marcus. Thank you for taking care of my flowers." As the child approached Thomas Jr.'s grave, the German shepherds moved to flank him, taking positions that seemed as natural as breathing. The boy knelt beside his own headstone and placed his small hand over the carved letters of his name. "I have something for you." "Uncle Levi," he said, reaching into a pocket that seemed to contain impossible depths. "From Papa." What he withdrew made Levi's heart stop completely. A letter sealed with wax that bore the impression of Thomas's signet ring. The paper was pristine, despite being 40 years old, as if it had been preserved in some realm where time held no dominion. "He wrote this before he died," Thomas Jr. explained. "Asked me to make sure you got it when you were ready to forgive yourself." With trembling hands, Levi accepted the letter that had traveled impossible distances to find him. As his fingers touched the wax seal, he felt something settle in his chest. Not peace, not yet, but the possibility of peace. The first step on a journey toward redemption that a dying child had been orchestrating from beyond the grave for 20 long years. The letter from Thomas lay unopened on Levi's kitchen table for 3 days, as if the weight of 40 years of guilt made his fingers too heavy to break the wax seal. The German shepherds had taken to lying beneath the table, their watchful eyes never leaving the piece of paper that represented either salvation or damnation. Levi wasn't sure which. On the 4th morning, with dawn light streaming through his cabin windows, he finally found the courage to read his brother's final words. The wax seal cracked easily, releasing the faint scent of tobacco and leather that had always clung to Thomas's clothes. Inside, written in his brother's careful script, were words that reached across 4 decades to touch a heart that had thought itself beyond healing. "My dear brother Levi, if you're reading this, then the boy kept his promise and found you after all these years. I'm writing this while the doctor tends to my wound, though we both know there's nothing he can do for a belly shot like this one. I've got maybe a day left, maybe less, and there are things that need saying before I meet whatever judgment awaits a man like me. First, and most important, I don't blame you for leaving me in Abilene. I know what choice you faced in that bank, and I know you made the only decision that might keep one of us alive. A dead brother can't help Sarah or the baby, and a live one might still find a way to make things right. But here's what I need you to understand. Levi, you've always carried the weight of keeping us both alive. Ever since we were boys, and Pa would come home drunk and mean. You took beatings meant for me, stole food to keep me fed, lied to the law to keep me out of jail. You've been more father than brother to me, and I never thanked you proper for that. The baby Sarah's carrying, your nephew or niece, they're going to need family when I'm gone. Not just Sarah's people, but Gable blood. Someone to teach them about where they come from, about the good men we might have been if circumstances had been different. I know you'll think you're not worthy of that honor. No, you'll believe that leaving me here disqualifies you from being anyone's uncle. But you're wrong about that, brother. The man who taught me to read, who showed me how to carve wood animals, who kept me laughing even when the world seemed bent on breaking us, that's the uncle I want for my child. Sarah has a map showing how to find Marrow Creek, the place she picked for us to settle down. It's nowhere special, just a little town where a man can disappear if he needs to. When you're ready to stop running, look for her there. She'll be waiting. I forgive you for Abilene, Levi. More than that, I thank you for 40 years of looking after your little brother. Now it's time for you to look after yourself. Take care of my family. Take care of Sarah and the baby. And maybe, if you can find it in your heart, forgive yourself the way I've already forgiven you, your loving brother, Thomas. Levi read the letter 3 times before the words stopped blurring through his tears. Thomas had known, had understood the impossible situation and made peace with it before he died. More than that, he'd spent his final hours thinking not about revenge or blame, but about how to heal the family that would survive him. But Sarah was dead. The baby, Thomas Jr., was dead. The family Thomas had wanted him to protect had been lost, while Levi spent 40 years running from the very love that might have saved them all. That afternoon, driven by a restlessness he couldn't name, Levi found himself searching through his belongings for something he'd hidden so well he'd almost forgotten its existence. In a leather pouch buried beneath his floorboards, wrapped in oilcloth against the moisture, was the most damning evidence of his past, the original map he'd drawn of the Abilene bank robbery. The paper was yellow with age, but still legible, covered in his own careful notations. Escape routes marked in red ink. Guard positions noted in the margins. The location of the bank vault detailed, with the precision of a military engineer. And there, in the corner of the map, a small X marking the spot where he'd left Thomas bleeding in the dust. But it was another mark on the map that caught his attention now. A circle drawn around a grove of cottonwood trees, half a mile from the bank, with the notation, "Emergency Cash, 3,000 written in his younger self's confident handwriting. The money. After 40 years, he'd forgotten about the emergency fund he'd buried as insurance against exactly the kind of disaster that had befallen them in Abilene. $3,000 in gold and silver. Enough to buy a farm, or start a business, or support a young mother and her child. The money that could have saved Sarah and Thomas Jr. if he'd remembered it existed. The realization hit him like a physical blow. While Sarah had struggled to raise his nephew alone, while she'd spent her final years searching for the uncle who might help provide for her son, Levi had been sitting on a fortune that could have changed everything. The money was still there, buried treasure that had been waiting 40 years for its owner to remember his obligations, as if responding to his emotional turmoil. The supernatural activity around his cabin began to intensify. The temperature dropped 20 degrees without warning, frost forming on windows in the middle of summer. Objects moved on their own, his coffee cup sliding across the table, books falling from shelves. The wooden cross he'd found dancing in midair as if held by invisible hands. The German shepherds became agitated, pacing the perimeter of his cabin and whining softly at sounds only they could hear. Through the windows, Levi could see figures moving in his peripheral vision, shadowy forms that vanished when he looked directly at them, but lingered at the edges of his awareness. Then the voices started. Thomas's voice, calling his name from different corners of the cabin. Sarah's voice, soft and forgiving, asking about the baby. And underneath it all, the sound of a child laughing, Thomas Jr.'s spirit. Still trying to bring his scattered family together, Doc Henderson found him that evening, sitting on his porch, with the robbery map spread across his knees, staring at the X that marked his brother's final resting place. "The whole town's talking," Doc said, settling into the chair beside him. "Folks are seeing things. Dead relatives, childhood friends, people who passed years ago. It's like whatever boundary keeps the living and dead separate has gone thin around here." "It's my fault," Levi said quietly. "All of it. Thomas Jr. has been trying to tell me something, and I've been too thick-headed to understand." Doc studied the map with professional interest. "This is where Thomas died? This is where I left him to die." Levi's voice cracked with the weight of confession. "But there's something else. Something I buried and forgot about until today." He pointed to the circled grove of trees. "Emergency money. $3,000. Enough to have kept Sarah and the boy comfortable for years. It's still there, Doc. Still buried where I left it 40 years ago." Understanding dawned in Doc's eyes. "You have to go back." "I have to go back," Levi agreed. "Not just for the money, though God knows Sarah's memory deserves that much. I have to go back because Thomas Jr. is trying to tell me something. And the only way I'm going to understand is to face what I did in that place." The dogs had stopped their pacing and now sat, watching the two men with the patient attention of creatures who understood that important decisions were being made. As if on cue, the ghostly laughter of a child echoed from inside the cabin, not mournful or frightening, but encouraging. Like a boy cheering on an adult who was finally ready to do the right thing. "I'll go with you," Doc said. "This isn't your burden to carry." "Thomas Jr. was my cousin too," Doc replied firmly. "And if there's a chance to set things right, to bring some peace to that boy's spirit, then it's as much my responsibility as yours." As night fell over Marrow Creek, Levi began making preparations for a journey he'd avoided for 40 years. The robbery map would guide them back to Abilene, back to the scene of his greatest failure. But this time, he wouldn't be running away from the consequences of his choices. This time, he was going home to face them. Sheriff Tom Briggs arrived at dawn with a bundle of yellowed wanted posters tucked under his arm, and the grim expression of a man who'd spent the night wrestling with his conscience. The supernatural disturbances had spread beyond Levi's cabin now, affecting the entire town of Marrow Creek. Half the residents reported seeing deceased relatives in their homes, while the other half claimed to hear voices calling from empty rooms. "We need to talk," Tom said, spreading the wanted posters across Levi's kitchen table like a hand of cards dealt by fate itself. "These came in on yesterday's mail packet. Federal marshals are asking questions about old cases, specifically unsolved bank robberies from the 1870s. Levi's blood ran cold as he saw his own face staring back from the aged paper, 28 years old. Clean-shaven, with the hard eyes of a man who'd learned to kill before he'd learned to love. Beside his photograph was another showing Thomas, younger and softer-featured, but unmistakably a Gable brother. "The Gable brothers," Tom read aloud. "Wanted for bank robbery, murder, and conspiracy. Last seen in Abilene, Texas, 1872. Reward, $5,000 dead or alive." But it wasn't the reward money that made Levi's hands shake. It was the list of charges beneath their names. 7 banks robbed across 3 states. 14 people dead, including 2 lawmen and a bank clerk who'd been barely old enough to shave. The Gable brothers hadn't just been thieves. They'd been killers, leaving a trail of blood and broken families across half the American frontier. "How many of these charges are true?" Tom asked quietly. Levi stared at the litany of crimes, memories flooding back with devastating clarity. "All of them," he whispered. "Every last one." The German shepherds had been restless all morning, pacing the cabin's perimeter and whining at sounds only they could hear. Now they suddenly went silent, their heads turned towards something beyond the eastern horizon. Through the cabin's windows, the air began to shimmer like heat waves rising from summer pavement. Do you see that? Doc Henderson's voice came from the doorway, where he stood with his medical bag and a look of professional fascination. The atmospheric disturbance? What Levi saw defied description. The air around his cabin was becoming transparent, as if reality itself was growing thin. Through the shimmering distortion, he caught glimpses of other times. Other places, the main street of Abilene as it had looked 40 years ago, complete with hitching posts and wooden sidewalks that had long since rotted away. "It's happening all over town," Doc continued, stepping inside and setting down his bag. "Mrs. Patterson swears she can see her late husband working in their garden. The Miller boys claim their grandfather is sitting on their front porch, smoking the pipe he was buried with." Tom studied the wanted posters with growing unease. "These deaths, Levi, the people you and Thomas killed, their families are still alive, some of them, still waiting for justice." The weight of 14 lives pressed down on Levi's shoulders like stones. He'd carried their names in his journal, had written letters of apology that were never sent, had tried to atone through 40 years of exile. But paper penance and self-imposed punishment couldn't resurrect the dead or heal the wounds left in grieving hearts. "There's something else," Tom said, pulling out a more recent telegraph. Federal marshals received a tip 3 days ago about suspicious activity in Marrow Creek. Someone reported seeing the Gable brothers in town. "That's impossible. Thomas has been dead for—" "I know when Thomas died," Tom interrupted. "Question is, who sent that telegraph? And why now, after all these years?" The answer came in the form of a child's laughter, echoing from the walls themselves, followed by Thomas Jr.'s voice, clear as if he were standing in the room. "Uncle Levi needs to finish what Papa started. The families need to know." Doc's face had gone pale, but his voice remained steady. "The boy's spirit. He's orchestrating all of this, isn't he? The supernatural activity, the federal attention, even bringing you those dogs. He's been planning this reunion for 20 years. Through the shimmering air, Levi could see more clearly now into the past. The streets of Abilene materialized around them, complete with the First National Bank, where everything had gone so terribly wrong. He could see himself and Thomas riding into town that morning, young and arrogant and convinced they were invincible. Could see the moment when everything fell apart, shots fired too early. Innocent bystanders caught in the crossfire. Thomas clutching his belly as blood seeped between his fingers. "The families," Levi said, understanding finally dawning. "Thomas Jr. isn't just trying to reunite our family. He's trying to bring justice to all the families we destroyed." As if summoned by his words, figures began materializing in the cabin's main room. Not the friendly spirits of loved ones that other townspeople reported, but the angry ghosts of the Gable brothers' victims. A bank clerk with a bullet hole in his chest. A lawman whose badge was stained with his own blood. A young mother who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time when the shooting started. They didn't speak, these spirits of the dead. They simply stood watching Levi with eyes that held 40 years of accusation. Their presence a reminder that some debts could never be fully paid. "Jesus," Tom breathed, his hand instinctively moving to his sidearm. "What do they want?" "The same thing Thomas Jr. wants," Levi said, finally understanding the full scope of his nephew's plan. "Acknowledgement, confession, some kind of justice for the lives we took." The wanted posters on the table began to move on their own, rearranging themselves into a pattern that formed a rough map. The locations of each bank robbery, each death, each family left to mourn without closure. The ghostly figures pointed toward the papers, their message clear. "These crimes must be answered for," Martha Kellaway's voice called from outside the cabin. "Levi, you need to come see this." They found her standing in the yard, pointing toward the horizon, where a dust cloud was approaching from the east. As the riders drew closer, Levi could make out the glint of federal badges and the purposeful movement of men who'd traveled far to settle old scores. "U.S. Marshals," Tom said grimly. "3 of them by the look of it." The German shepherds moved to flank Levi, their posture protective but calm. They understood, as he was beginning to understand. that this confrontation had been inevitable from the moment Thomas Jr.'s spirit had decided to intervene in the affairs of the living. "What are you going to do?" Doc asked. Levi looked at the approaching lawman, then at the ghostly figures still visible through his cabin windows, then at the robbery map that showed the location of money he'd never spent and graves he'd never visited. "What I should have done 40 years ago," he said quietly. "Tell the truth." As the marshals dismounted in his yard, Levi stepped forward with his hands visible and his shoulders straight. The time for running was over. The time for hiding behind other men's names and manufactured identities had passed. Thomas Jr. had orchestrated this moment with the patience of the dead and the love of family. And Levi would not dishonor that sacrifice by cowering now. "Gentlemen," he said to the approaching lawman, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd finally found his courage. "My name is Levi Gable, and I believe you've been looking for me for quite some time." Behind him, barely visible in the morning light, the spirit of a 7-year-old boy smiled with satisfaction. The first phase of his plan was complete. Now came the harder part, teaching a broken man how to heal not just his own family, but all the families his choices had shattered across 4 decades of pain. The federal marshals were professional men, weathered by years of tracking dangerous criminals across unforgiving territory. But when Levi Gable surrendered himself that morning, admitting to crimes that had gone unsolved for 40 years, even they seemed unprepared for the strange circumstances surrounding his confession. "Mr. Gable," said Marshal William Hayes, the senior lawman, "you understand you're confessing to multiple counts of murder, bank robbery and conspiracy?" "I understand," Levi replied, his hands remaining visible and steady. "But there are things you need to know about how you found me and why my surrender is happening now." What followed was unlike any arrest in Marshal Hayes' 20-year career. As Levi began to tell his story about the mysterious boy, the German shepherds, the supernatural events plaguing Marrow Creek, the very air around them began to shimmer with otherworldly energy. The spirits that had been haunting his cabin grew stronger, more visible, until even the hardened lawmen could see the ghostly figures of their victims standing in silent judgment. But it was Doc Henderson who provided the revelation that changed everything. "Marshal Hayes," Doc said, approaching with a small wooden box in his hands. "There's something else you need to see. Something that might explain why the dead won't let this case rest." Inside the box was a tintype photograph that made Levi's blood turn to ice water. It showed Sarah holding not one infant, but 2, twin boys so identical that only a mother could tell them apart. The photograph was dated just 3 months after Thomas Jr.'s supposed birth, and written on the back in Sarah's careful script were the names Thomas Jr. and Marcus. "That's impossible," Levi breathed. "Thomas Jr. died at 7 years old. I saw his grave." Doc's smile was sad and complicated. "Thomas Jr. did die at 7, but his twin brother didn't." The world tilted on its axis as understanding crashed over Levi like a physical blow. Doc Henderson, the man who'd been caring for him, who'd been tending Thomas Jr.'s grave for 20 years, who'd known his identity from the beginning, was his nephew, Sarah's son. "Thomas's son. You're Marcus," Levi whispered. "Marcus Henderson, yes. Born Marcus Gable on the same day as my brother, but raised by Sarah's sister after our mother died." Doc's voice carried 40 years of patient waiting. "I've known who you were since the day you arrived in Marrow Creek, known you were the Uncle Thomas Jr. used to talk about, the one he said would come home when the time was right." Marshal Hayes was studying the photograph with professional skepticism. "You're telling me that you're this man's nephew, and you've been hiding his identity for how long?" "Not hiding," Doc corrected. "Protecting." There's a difference. The German shepherds had moved closer to Doc, their behavior suddenly making perfect sense. They hadn't been guarding Levi. They'd been protecting the family reunion that Thomas Jr.'s spirit had been orchestrating from beyond the grave. "My brother died believing Uncle Levi would come home someday. Doc continued, his medical training evident in the calm way he delivered devastating information. Died believing that our father's ghost would find a way to bring us all together. I've spent 20 years preparing for this day, keeping his grave tended, keeping his memory alive, waiting for the moment when our family would be complete again. Levi stared at the man who'd been caring for him without revealing their blood connection, who'd known all along that he was treating his own uncle for various ailments and injuries. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you weren't ready to hear it. Men carrying that much guilt don't heal overnight. Uncle Levi, they need time to learn they're worth saving." The supernatural activity that had been building around them suddenly intensified to an almost unbearable degree. The air shimmered like water, and through the distortion, they could see not just glimpses of the past, but scenes from the present playing out simultaneously. Thomas Jr.'s spirit appeared clearly now, no longer the mysterious boy who delivered the dogs, but recognizably Doc's twin, the same gentle eyes, the same serious expression, the same stubborn Gable jawline. "Hello, Uncle Levi," Thomas Jr. said, his voice carrying across 40 years of separation. "I told you I'd find a way to bring our family together." Marshal Hayes had drawn his weapon, though what use bullets might be against ghosts remained unclear. "What in the Sam Hill is going on here?" "Justice," said another voice, and Thomas Gable himself materialized beside his son, looking exactly as he had in life but bearing no trace of the wounds that had killed him. "Justice for our family and for all the families we wronged." The elder Thomas turned to face the marshals with the dignity of a man who'd spent 40 years in whatever realm awaited the dead. "My brother has been punishing himself for leaving me in Abilene, carrying guilt that belongs to both of us. But there are other debts that need settling, other families that deserve answers." More spirits appeared, not just the victims of the Gable brothers' crimes, but their surviving relatives. Children who'd grown up without fathers, wives who'd been left widowed, parents who'd buried sons before their time. They stood in a growing circle around the living, not threatening, but expectant. "The money," Thomas Jr. said, pointing toward the robbery map that lay on the ground where Levi had dropped it. "Papa hid money that could have helped all these families. Money that's been waiting 40 years to be returned to the people it was stolen from." Levi looked at his nephew, both his nephews living and dead, and understood the full scope of what was being asked of him. Not just confession, but restitution. Not just acknowledgement of guilt, but active work to heal the wounds his crimes had created. "The cash in Abilene," he said slowly. $3,000, plus whatever interest 40 years in the ground might have earned it. Marshal Hayes holstered his weapon, apparently deciding that supernatural justice was beyond his jurisdiction. "Mr. Gable, are you offering to lead us to stolen money?" "I'm offering to do what I should have done 40 years ago. Make things right, as much as any man can after so much time has passed." Doc, Marcus, his nephew Marcus, stepped forward with the quiet authority of a man who'd spent decades preparing for this moment. "The families of your victims deserve to know what happened to their loved ones. They deserve apologies, explanations, whatever closure you can provide. And the money could help," added Thomas Jr.'s spirit, his boyish voice carrying wisdom beyond his years. "Help the families still struggling, help the communities you damaged, help heal wounds that have been festering for 4 decades. Thomas's ghost placed a translucent hand on Levi's shoulder, the touch somehow both insubstantial and comforting. "This was always the plan, brother. Not revenge, but redemption. Not punishment, but healing." As the supernatural forces that had been building around Marrow Creek began to stabilize, settling into something that felt less like chaos and more like resolution, Levi understood that his nephew's plan had been far more complex than simple family reunion. Thomas Jr. had orchestrated not just the return of his living uncle, but a reckoning with 40 years of unfinished business. The German shepherds, their mission as spiritual messengers complete, began to fade like morning mist. But before they disappeared entirely, they approached each member of the strange gathering, living and dead, and received what could only be described as blessing. Even the hardened federal marshals found themselves moved to touch the noble animals' heads before they vanished into whatever realm had sent them. "So, what happens now?" Marshal Hayes asked, his voice carrying a respect that hadn't been there an hour earlier. Levi looked around the circle of faces: living nephew, dead brother, ghostly son, patient lawmen, and the spirits of people whose lives had been cut short by his choices. For the first time in 40 years, he felt the weight of purpose rather than the burden of guilt. "Now we go to Abilene," he said firmly. "We dig up the money, we visit the graves, and we start the long work of making amends. However long it takes, however hard it is, we set things right." Thomas Jr.'s spirit smiled with the satisfaction of a child who'd successfully completed the most important task of 2 lifetimes. "Papa said you'd figure it out eventually. Uncle Levi said you just needed time to remember who you really are." As the spirits began to fade, with their message delivered and their plan set in motion, Levi felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood: the security of belonging to a family that loved him, despite his failures. The boy's touch hadn't been a call to judgment after all. It had been an invitation to come home. The journey to Abilene took 3 days. A strange procession of lawmen, living family and spirits that flickered in and out of visibility like candle flames in a gentle breeze. Levi rode alongside his nephew Marcus, marveling at how the man's steady presence had been a source of comfort for years, without his knowing the true reason why. The federal marshals maintained a respectful distance, understanding instinctively that they were witnessing something beyond their normal jurisdiction. "Tell me about Thomas Jr.," Levi said on the second day, as they made camp beside a stream that he remembered from his outlaw days. "What was he like as a boy?" Marcus smiled with the gentle expression Levi was learning to recognize as purely Gable family trait. "Stubborn as a mule, just like Papa and you. But kind, too. Had a way of seeing the good in people even when they couldn't see it in themselves. Did he really talk to spirits?" "Every day of his life. Used to tell me stories about Papa visiting him in dreams, about how you were traveling somewhere far away, but thinking about us. Mother tried to convince him it was just imagination, but I could tell she believed it too. The cache of money lay exactly where Levi had buried it 40 years earlier, in a grove of cottonwood trees, half a mile from the Abilene bank. The leather pouch had protected most of the gold and silver from the elements, though some of the paper currency had deteriorated beyond recognition. Still, the marshal's expert count put the total at just over $3,000, a fortune by frontier standards. Enough to have supported Sarah and her twins in comfort for years. "Blood money," Levi said, staring at coins that had cost 14 lives to acquire. "Redemption money now," corrected Thomas Jr.'s spirit, who had grown stronger and more visible as they'd approached the scene of his father's death. "Money that can heal instead of harm." Marshal Hayes was documenting everything with the methodical precision of a man who understood he was creating historical records. "The families of your victims. We've managed to contact most of them over the years. Some have moved on, started new lives. Others are still struggling with what you and your brother took from them. I want to meet them," Levi said. "All of them, if they're willing. They deserve to hear the truth from me, not from wanted posters or newspaper accounts." The first family they visited was perhaps the hardest. James Morrison had been 19 years old when the Gable brothers shot him during their escape from the cattleman's bank in Kansas. He'd left behind a pregnant wife and elderly parents who'd depended on his wages from the telegraph office. Now, 40 years later, his widow Rebecca sat across from Levi in her modest parlor. Her hair silver, but her eyes still sharp with memory. "You killed my husband," she said without preamble. "Yes, ma'am, I did. And I've carried that weight every day since." "Weight," she considered the word. "That's interesting. Do you think your weight compares to mine? Raising his son alone. Watching that boy grow up wondering why his father never came home." Levi had no answer that wouldn't sound like an excuse, so he offered none. Instead, he placed a stack of gold coins on the table between them, more money than Rebecca Morrison had seen in years. "This won't bring James back," he said. "Won't give your son the father he deserved. Won't take away 40 years of struggling alone. But it's part of what we stole from you that day, and it belongs with his family." Rebecca stared at the money for a long moment, then at the man who'd taken so much from her.
"Why now?"
she asked. "Why come forward after all this time?" It was Thomas Jr.'s spirit who answered, appearing in the parlor with the casual ease of a child visiting favorite relatives. Rebecca couldn't see him, but her expression softened as if she sensed some presence beyond the physical world. "Because the dead don't rest easy when justice goes unserved," Levi said, speaking the words Thomas Jr. whispered in his ear. "And because my nephew spent 20 years teaching me that some mistakes can still be made right, even when it seems too late." The encounters that followed were variations on the same theme: grief acknowledged, responsibility accepted. What restitution was possible offered without excuse or expectation of forgiveness. Some families slammed doors in his face. Others wept. A few, like Rebecca Morrison, listened to his confession with the dignity of people who'd learned to live with loss. But it was the visit to Thomas's actual grave that proved most challenging. The bank where he died was long gone, replaced by a hardware store that bore no trace of the violence that had occurred there. But the cemetery where Thomas's body lay buried was exactly as Levi remembered it, a windswept plot on a hill overlooking the town where both brothers' lives had taken their final, tragic turn. The headstone was simple: Thomas Gable, died 1872, aged 26. No mention of the circumstances, no judgment from beyond the grave, just the basic facts of a life cut short. "Hello, brother," Levi said, kneeling beside the grave, with Marcus standing quietly behind him. "I came back just like I promised." Thomas's spirit materialized beside his own headstone, more solid and present than he'd appeared since the supernatural events began. "Took you long enough. Had to learn some things first. Had to understand what family really means. And do you understand now?" Levi looked at Marcus, at Thomas Jr.'s spirit, at the federal marshals who'd somehow become part of this strange healing ritual, at the shadows of all the people whose lives had been touched by the Gable brothers' crimes. "I'm beginning to," he said. "Family isn't just blood, it's responsibility. It's showing up when people need you, even when, especially when, you've failed them before." The ground around Thomas's grave began to glow with a soft, warm light that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. As Levi watched in wonder, wildflowers began to bloom across the previously barren plot: bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush, the same flowers that grew wild around Marrow Creek. "The land is healing," Thomas Jr. observed with satisfaction. "Papa's been waiting 40 years for Uncle Levi to come home. Now maybe he can rest." But Thomas's spirit shook his head. "Not yet, son. There's still work to do." That evening, in the hotel room the marshals had secured for their prisoner, Levi sat at a small writing desk with a stack of paper and a pen that felt heavy as a pistol in his hands. One by one, he began writing letters to every family affected by the Gable brothers' crimes. Not just the direct victims, but their children, their parents, their siblings and friends whose lives had been altered by violence and loss. Marcus sat beside him, helping with names and addresses, sharing what he'd learned from 20 years of medical practice about the lasting wounds that trauma leaves in communities. "Some of them won't want to read your letters," Marcus warned. "Some of them will," Levi replied, his pen moving steadily across the paper. "And for those who do, maybe it'll help to know that the men who hurt them didn't just ride away and forget. That at least one of us carried their pain along with our own." Thomas Jr.'s spirit appeared beside the writing desk, his boyish face serious with the weight of 40 years' planning finally coming to fruition. "The letters are important, Uncle Levi, but they're not the end. Tomorrow you have to face the hardest part." "What's that, son?" "Forgiving yourself." The next morning would bring the final confrontation, not with law or vengeance, but with the possibility of redemption that a dead child had spent 2 decades orchestrating. The money would be distributed, the confessions made, the legal consequences accepted. But the true climax of Thomas Jr.'s plan would require something far more difficult than facing federal marshals or grieving families. It would require Levi Gable to finally accept that some men— The site where Thomas died was unmarked by any monument or memorial, just a patch of ground behind what had once been the First National Bank of Abilene. The building itself was long gone, replaced by modern storefronts that bore no trace of the violence that had occurred there 40 years earlier. But Levi knew the exact spot, could see it as clearly as if the shooting had happened yesterday. "This is where it happened," he said, kneeling on the dusty ground while Marcus and Marshal Hayes stood respectfully nearby. "This is where I left him." Thomas's spirit materialized more solidly than ever before, no longer the wounded outlaw of memory, but a man at peace, his form glowing with an inner light that seemed to emanate from forgiveness itself. "You didn't leave me, brother," Thomas said, his voice carrying across 4 decades of separation. "You made the only choice that might keep part of our family alive." But Levi shook his head, pulling from his pocket the final piece of evidence he'd carried all these years, a blood-stained piece of wood that he'd torn from the bank's hitching post as he'd fled. On it, carved in his brother's dying hand, were words that had haunted him every day since Abilene. "Tell my boy I forgive him." "You wrote this with your own blood," Levi said, holding up the weathered wood. "Your final words, carved into this post while I rode away like a coward." Thomas's spirit stared at the wooden fragment, confusion replacing the peaceful expression he'd worn moments before. "That's not what I wrote, Levi. I saw it with my own eyes. Came back 3 days later to bury me," Thomas finished. "I remember now. You did come back, didn't you? After the money, after escaping, after everything went to hell, you came back to make sure I had a proper grave." The memory came flooding back with devastating clarity. Levi had indeed returned to Abilene 3 days after the robbery, driven by guilt and the desperate hope that somehow his brother had survived. But Thomas was already dead, his body laid out in the undertaker's parlor while the town debated whether to bury an outlaw in their cemetery. Levi had waited until nightfall, then stolen Thomas's body and given him the burial their father never received, under the cottonwood trees where they'd played as children, with words of love carved into a makeshift headstone. "The blood on the wood," Thomas said, his spiritual form growing brighter as understanding dawned. "It wasn't from carving words, Levi. It was from where you held my hand as I died." The revelation hit like a physical blow. But the message— "Look closer, brother. Look at what the words really say." Levi examined the bloody fragment through 40 years of guilt and self-recrimination, trying to see past the interpretation that had defined his exile. Slowly, letter by letter, the true message became clear. Not "tell my boy I forgive him," words of forgiveness from a dying father to an unknown son, but "tell my boy I love him." The desperate final message of a man who knew he'd never see his child grow up. "You weren't asking for forgiveness," Levi whispered, his voice breaking with the weight of 4 decades of misunderstanding. "You were asking me to tell Thomas Jr. that his father loved him." "And you did tell him," Thomas Jr.'s spirit said, appearing beside his father with the radiant joy of a child whose deepest wishes have finally been fulfilled. "Every story, Mama. Sarah told me about Papa. Every time she said he would have been proud of me. Every moment she made me feel loved, despite growing up without him. That was you keeping Papa's promise." The ground around them began to warm, as if the earth itself was responding to the healing of this fundamental misunderstanding. The bloody wood in Levi's hands grew light, the stains fading as the burden of false guilt lifted from his shoulders. "But I left you," Levi protested, 40 years of self-hatred struggling against the possibility of redemption. "I chose the money over my brother's life. You chose survival over certain death," Thomas corrected gently. "If you'd stayed, we both would have died in that alley." Our family line would have ended. Thomas Jr. would never have known he had an uncle who carried his father's love, and Marcus would have grown up without any connection to the Gable name. Marcus stepped forward, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Uncle Levi, don't you understand? Everything that's happened, Mama Sarah finding you through letters, Thomas Jr.'s spirit guiding you home, even these supernatural events bringing us together, it was all possible because you survived. Because you made the hardest choice a man can make and lived with the consequences." The three spirits that had been guiding this reunion, Thomas Jr., and even Sarah, who materialized now for the first time, stood together as a family finally made whole. Not through death, not through guilt or punishment, but through the simple act of a man finally understanding that love, not fear, had motivated his most difficult decision. "The German shepherds," Levi said, understanding flooding through him. "They weren't sent to punish me. They were sent to protect you," Thomas Jr. confirmed, "while you learned what we already knew, that Uncle Levi was worth saving." As the spiritual reunion reached its crescendo, the air around them filled with a warmth and light that seemed to emanate from love itself. The healing that had begun with the mysterious boy's touch was nearing completion, but there was still one final step that would determine whether redemption was truly possible for a man who'd spent 40 years believing himself unworthy of it. The wooden cross that Levi carved that afternoon was different from the crude marker he'd made 40 years earlier when burying his brother in secret. This one was crafted with the patience of a man who finally understood the true meaning of memorial, not just acknowledging death, but celebrating the love that survives beyond it. Using his old knife and the same careful technique Thomas had taught him as a boy, Levi shaped the cottonwood wood into something worthy of the brother who'd forgiven him before forgiveness was needed. He carved Thomas's name deep into the crossbeam, along with the dates of his birth and death, but added something more. Words that had taken 4 decades to understand. Beloved brother and father, who chose love over fear. Marcus worked beside him, using his medical training to prepare Thomas's remains for proper burial. The original grave had been a hasty affair, dug in grief and haste. This one would be different, deep enough to protect the bones, lined with stones to mark it as sacred ground, positioned to catch the morning sun that Thomas had always loved. "Tell me about the day he died," Marcus said as they worked. "I need to know what his final hours were really like." Levi's hands stilled on the cross as memories he'd tried to bury came flooding back. "He wasn't afraid," he said finally. "That's what I remember most. Shot in the gut, bleeding to death in that alley, and he wasn't afraid. What was he thinking about? You, both of you, the son he'd never meet and the son he was leaving behind. He made me promise to tell you that your father was a good man, that the choices he made came from love, not greed or violence." Thomas's spirit appeared beside his own bones, no longer bound by the trauma of his death, but free to speak truths that had been locked away by guilt and misunderstanding. "I spent my final hours grateful," Thomas said, his voice carrying clearly to both living family members. "Grateful that Sarah would have help raising our sons. Grateful that you'd survived to carry our family forward. Grateful that love had won out over all the violence and pain." The reburial ceremony was simple but profound. Marshal Hayes served as witness, understanding that he was observing not just the closing of a criminal case, but the healing of a family torn apart by impossible circumstances. The federal marshals who'd traveled so far to arrest a long-dead outlaw found themselves moved by the dignity with which Thomas Gable was finally laid to rest. Beside his son, as Levi placed the wooden cross at the head of the grave, Thomas Jr.'s spirit stepped forward with something that had been hidden from view until this moment, a small wooden toy, carved in the shape of a horse that he placed beside his father's marker. "I made this for Papa when I was 6, the boy explained. "Kept it with me when I died, hoping someday I'd get to give it to him proper." The toy horse began to glow with the same inner light that surrounded the spirits, and as it did, something miraculous occurred. The barren ground around the grave burst into bloom, not just wildflowers, but fruit trees, grapevines, all manner of growing things that spoke of life, triumphing over death. The land is healing, Sarah's spirit observed, appearing with the same radiant peace that marked her husband and son. 40 years of guilt and grief are finally being washed clean, but it was what happened next that truly completed the spiritual transformation that had been building since the mysterious boy's first touch. As Levi knelt beside his brother's grave, finally understanding that his survival had been necessary for their family's continuation rather than evidence of his cowardice, the German shepherds materialized one final time. They approached not as supernatural guardians or mysterious messengers, but as simple dogs seeking the affection of a man who'd finally learned he was worthy of love. Levi reached out and touched their heads, feeling in that contact not just the softness of fur, but the accumulated love of all the family members, living and dead, who'd worked to bring him home. "Thank you," he whispered to the animals, understanding that they represented something far greater than themselves. "Thank you for not giving up on me." The dogs wagged their tails once, then began to fade as their mission reached completion. But before they disappeared entirely, they left behind something that would remain long after the supernatural events had ended. 2 perfect paw prints in the soft earth beside Thomas's grave, marking the spot where love had finally conquered 40 years of self-inflicted exile. As the sun set over Abilene, casting long shadows across the cemetery where the Gable family was finally reunited, the spirits of Thomas Jr. and Sarah began to fade as well, not departing in sadness, but dissolving into the peaceful light of souls finally released from earthly concerns. "Will I see you again?" Levi asked as his brother's form grew translucent. "Every day," Thomas replied, his voice already growing distant. "Every time you choose love over fear, every time you help someone in need, every time you remember that survival isn't something to feel guilty about, it's a gift to be treasured." Thomas Jr.'s spirit was the last to fade, lingering just long enough to deliver one final message that would reshape how Levi understood his remaining years. "The boy who brought you the dogs. Uncle Levi, that was me, but it was also you. Sometimes healing requires us to become the children we once were, to touch the wounded parts of ourselves with the same forgiveness we'd offer an innocent." As the last traces of supernatural presence faded from the cemetery, Levi found himself alone with Marcus and the federal marshals, not abandoned, but finally free to begin the earthly work of redemption that his family's love had made possible. 6 months after the events in Abilene, Levi Gable walked out of the federal courthouse in Austin a free man. The judge, after hearing testimony about his cooperation with authorities, his restitution to victims' families, and the unprecedented circumstances of his surrender, had sentenced him to time already served plus community service, specifically using his knowledge of outlaw tactics to help train federal marshals in tracking dangerous criminals. "Justice tempered with mercy," the judge had said, in recognition of a man who chose to face his past rather than continue running from it. Marcus Henderson was waiting on the courthouse steps, his medical bag in one hand and a letter in the other. The months of separation had been difficult for both men, as they'd learned what it meant to be family after 40 years of living as strangers. But the bond forged by supernatural intervention had only grown stronger. "Welcome back to the land of the living, Uncle Levi," Marcus said, embracing him warmly. "How does freedom feel?" "Like responsibility," Levi replied, and he meant it. The guilt that had driven him into exile had been replaced by something far more demanding, the obligation to use his remaining years in service to the people he'd wronged and the family that had forgiven him. They returned to Marrow Creek together, but not to the isolated cabin where Levi had hidden from the world. Marcus had prepared a place for his uncle in his own home, transforming his medical practice into a family business where Levi's knowledge of violence could be repurposed into understanding of how to heal its effects. Turns out, Marcus explained as they unpacked Levi's few belongings, a man who's caused as much trauma as you have develops a unique perspective on helping others recover from it. The federal marshals weren't the only ones interested in what you've learned. The work was harder than Levi had expected, but more rewarding than anything he'd done in his outlaw years. Families who'd lost loved ones to violence sought him out, not for revenge, but for understanding. Law enforcement agencies requested his insights into criminal psychology. Most surprisingly, other aging outlaws began seeking him out, drawn by stories of a man who'd found a way to make peace with his past. Martha Kellaway was among his first visitors when he returned to Marrow Creek, arriving with a bundle that made his heart catch in his throat, Sarah's family Bible. Carefully preserved through decades of waiting. "She wanted you to have this," Martha said, placing the leather-bound book in his hands. "Said it belonged to the Gable family, and you were the last one left to carry on the name." But when Levi opened the Bible to the family record section, he discovered he wasn't the last Gable after all. Sarah had carefully maintained the family tree, adding Thomas Jr. and Marcus to the lineage. But she'd also left space, blank lines where future generations might someday be recorded. She believed in tomorrows, Martha observed. Even after losing Thomas, even after the boy died, she never stopped believing that the Gable name might still have something good to offer the world. Over the following months, Levi began the delicate work of rebuilding not just his own life, but the legacy of his entire family line. He established a fund using the money recovered from various caches he'd hidden during his outlaw years, providing support to families affected by frontier violence. He worked with Marcus to create a medical clinic that served the remote communities where wounded souls gathered. Places like Marrow Creek where people went to disappear and sometimes found healing instead. Most importantly, he began to tell the true story of the Gable brothers, speaking to schools and community groups about the real consequences of choosing violence over other solutions. His presentations weren't glorifications of outlaw life, but honest reckonings with the pain that violence creates, rippling outward through generations like stones thrown into still water. "The choice I made in Abilene," he would tell his audiences, "wasn't between good and evil. It was between one kind of loss and another. But the 40 years I spent running from that choice, that was where the real damage occurred. Not to the people I'd already hurt, but to the people I could have helped if I'd found the courage to face my mistakes sooner." On the first anniversary of Thomas Jr.'s spiritual intervention, Levi and Marcus made a pilgrimage to the cemetery outside Marrow Creek, where it all began. The grave was exactly as they'd left it, but the wildflowers that had been placed there weren't from their hands. A young woman stood beside the headstone, her blonde hair catching the morning light in a way that made Levi's heart skip. She looked up as they approached, and he saw in her face the unmistakable features of the Gable family line. Thomas's gentle eyes, Sarah's determined chin, and something new that spoke of strength earned through struggle. "Are you Uncle Levi?" she asked, her voice carrying the same soft authority that had marked Sarah's speech. "I am." "And you are?" "Emily Morrison," she said, extending her hand. "Rebecca Morrison's granddaughter. James Morrison's great-granddaughter. I came to thank you." The conversation that followed lasted most of the afternoon, weaving together the stories of two families whose lives had been intertwined by violence and separated by shame. Emily was a teacher now, working in schools, where children from broken homes came to learn that their circumstances didn't define their futures. "Grandma Rebecca never forgave you," Emily said as the sun began to set over the cemetery. But she did something more important. She chose not to let her anger poison another generation. She made sure I grew up knowing that healing was possible. Even after terrible loss, as Emily prepared to leave, she placed something on Thomas Jr.'s grave that made Levi's throat tight with emotion, a small wooden toy, carved in the shape of a horse, identical to the one the boy's spirit had left for his father. "I made this for the little boy who died before I could meet him," she explained. "Grandma Rebecca told me he was the one who helped you find your way home. I thought he should know that his family got bigger, not smaller because of what he did." That evening, as Levi and Marcus sat on the porch of their shared home, watching the sun set over the town that had become their sanctuary, Levi pulled out Sarah's family Bible and carefully wrote Emily Morrison's name in the section reserved for family friends, the people who, though not bound by blood, had chosen to be bound by love. "Thomas Jr. was right," Marcus observed, watching his uncle's careful handwriting. "Families do get bigger when people choose healing over hurt." Levi looked up from the Bible to see a familiar figure approaching through the twilight, a young boy walking with unhurried steps. But now Levi could see him clearly for what he'd always been, not a supernatural messenger, but the child he himself had once been, before violence and loss had taught him to fear his own capacity for love. The boy reached out and touched Levi's weathered hand one final time. But now the contact felt different, not like forgiveness from beyond the grave, but like acceptance from the innocent part of himself that had survived 40 years of guilt and was finally ready to trust in the possibility of redemption. As the child's form faded into the gathering darkness, Levi understood that his journey was complete. The mysterious boy who'd started it all had been himself all along, the part of his soul that had never stopped believing in the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. The German shepherds were gone, their mission accomplished. The spirits of his dead family had found their rest. But the living members of the Gable family, expanded now to include all those who'd chosen love over fear, healing over hatred, hope over despair, would continue their work for generations to come. In the growing darkness of a Texas evening, surrounded by family both living and remembered, Levi Gable finally found the peace that had eluded him for 40 years. Not the peace of a man who'd escaped consequences, but the deeper peace of one who'd learned that some mistakes, when faced with courage and love, can become the foundation for lives of unexpected grace.